Hello again, and thank you for signing on for another session of our trustee training series. Today we are talking about financing the budget cycle, state aid, and other income opportunities like grants. Again, you can find anything I referenced today in our LibGuides. You can either do the link that I put in chat or else from our website, library.nd.gov. Go to Services for Libraries and Education. Under the cloud, click LibGuides, and then scroll down to find the Public Library Board of Trustees LibGuide. It is chock full of fun information. Again, my name is Abby Ebach. I've been a public library specialist at the State Library for the past 3 years. And while I spend a lot of my time reading Century Code, I am not a lawyer. You can consider this your disclaimer that anything I say from the law is not considered legal advice, and all legal questions should be addressed to your local attorney. Also, for the sake of this particular session, I am not a financial advisor. I'm not an accountant. I am not an expert in any way on proper investment or budgeting practices. And so all of those type questions, I will direct you to your local financial expert or your auditor. And because this is a really big presentation, I have a third disclaimer. And it's that all cities and counties are going to manage their money, and this process is going to be a little different for every single library municipality situation. I don't have the knowledge base or the expertise to advise you on how your city or county should do these things. I can just talk in generalizations about how library budgeting and finances work, and then you can take that knowledge with you when you're talking about finances of the library with your funding bodies. Yeah, so this varies across the state. A lot of them are similar. I just really ask that you keep that in mind when you're talking to each other, your library director, other trustees. If you're talking to me or other state library staff, we're all just doing our best. Onwards from all of our disclaimers. Okay, so what is the library budget? A budget is a guide, or better put would be like a plan of how the library is going to spend its money for the next year. It's going to include revenue streams, so an anticipated funding from your local city or county government, state aid to public libraries from the state library, and then other consistent sources of income. Some libraries choose to include grants, donations, fines, and fundraising efforts into their budget. These things aren't guaranteed sources of income, and they can fluctuate dramatically from year to year. So for the most accurate budget, I typically suggest looking at your guaranteed sources of income and planning what the library can use those fines, donations, and other things do if raised. Some people, or some libraries, example, will fundraise exclusively for their summer reading program, and only the funds that they raise during the fundraiser will go towards that program. Once revenues are forecasted for your next either calendar or fiscal year, you're going to want to look at your expenditures. So expenditures are the categories that the library spends the money on. As I'm sure you know, that can be a lot of things: salaries and benefits, your collection, utilities, programs, the list goes on and on. During the budget process, the library director and board work together to make sure that the budget is balanced, which is to say the expenditures do not exceed the revenues and that all of your revenue is used. I also want to, mention the difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit budget. As a government entity, the library is obviously not for profit. You are not trying to make money as the library, but you're not like a not-for-profit or nonprofit either. Nonprofit organizations are mission-driven, and they receive all of their funding through revenues like grants and fundraising. And then libraries are in the weird middle ground of receiving government funding, but not working for a profit. And the only reason I really bring this up is because if you start Googling around about like, help me with my budget and the board and the budget, there's going to be a lot of similarities between nonprofits and libraries, but there are differences. And so you just, if your little flag goes up when you're reading something, you should pay attention to that. Okay, so what is a mill? Where does the library's money come from? A lot of places likely is where your funding's coming from, but the largest chunk of it is going to be from your taxpayers of your city or county through property taxes, which is measured in mills. One mill is 1/1000th of a property's taxable value. So if you want to know how much 1 mill is worth to you as an individual, you would take 0.001 and multiply it by the taxable value of your property. You likely receive a really nice letter in the mail every year telling you how much you're expected to pay in your property taxes, and that outlines everything for you. If you ever hear somebody like at a commission meeting talking about mill values in really large dollar amounts, they're probably not talking about like your personal 1 mill, but instead the total revenue brought into the budget for each mill assessed. So like as a whole, if you combined everyone in the city's mill value. There's a lot of great resources in our LibGuide about mill levies. There's even a webinar by the North Dakota Property Tax Division that they did specifically for librarians 2 years ago, I believe. It's a 25-minute recording and it explains taxing and mills beautifully. North Dakota Century Code outlines mill levy limitations in sections 5715.06.7 and 5715.1. Those place a cap at 4 mills, but there's a lot of nuances around that and exceptions that I'm not qualified to talk about or interpret, and quite frankly, have no desire to learn how to interpret that. You can work that out locally. And then, especially because I know a lot of you are from Grand Forks, but we have a lot of home rule communities in North Dakota. So a home rule charter, or if you're called like a home rule city, means that a city or county has adopted a charter to implement their own ordinances in regards to finances and property taxes, among a bunch of other things. So if your library is in a home rule community, you likely have more leeway in increasing your mill levy past that 4 amount, or you might receive your funds directly from the general fund. It purely depends on how your charter is written and interpreted. So again, this is all of my knowledge about property taxes. I can try and answer any questions about them, but I will likely say you have to figure it out locally. But that's just kind of your quick rundown of mills. Okay, so once that money is assessed, as per Century Code 403802, the governing body shall establish a library fund. The library fund shall consist of annually levying and causing to be collected a tax and any other monies received for library purposes from federal, state, county, municipal, or private sources. The city auditor or county treasurer shall establish and maintain the fund to account for library revenues and shall make payments from the fund for invoices that have been submitted and approved by the governing body of the library. The fund may not revert to the governing body at the end of any fiscal year. And the fund must be used exclusively for the establishment and maintenance of public library service. So that's a lot of Century Code quoted at you. And all of it is really important for different reasons. I find one of the most important sentences is that the library fund must be used exclusively for the establishment and maintenance of public library service. But like the general main pieces are that there should be a library fund and that this is kept separate from the governing body's general fund. And then the library fund is where all of the money for the library goes to from all levels of government, unless you have a Friends of the Library group or something like that that takes donations in for the library. A Friends or a foundation would have a separate account. Another part that I often am referring back to is that the library fund does not revert back to the general fund at the end of the year. So once citizens are taxed for library services, those funds go into the library fund for the sole purpose of, again, establishing and maintaining public library service in their city or county. So this shows that the city or county can't simply just reallocate library funds at their own discretion once those funds have been collected from the taxpayers. There's kind of some complementary code in 403804 number 3 that reads, the board of directors shall have the following powers and duties: to control exclusively the expenditures of all monies collected for or contributed to the library fund. So you, the board, are in charge of the entire library fund and how it is expended. This is, in general, what the budget process is going to look like for almost every library. Again, I say almost because I haven't talked to every single library specifically about this, but in theory, this is what it looks like most of the time. It's a very non-committal sentence. So typically, starting in the spring or early summer of the year, the library director is going to start prepping a draft budget. So this is going to include talking to the auditor and see how many mills were levied for library service, what the anticipated funding will be for the next fiscal year. After that, the director or board members on the committee can use a previous year's spending to begin an outline of what to expect in regards to both revenues and expenditures. So this is looking at fixed costs like utilities that aren't going to change very much, but then programming and collection budgets, which have a lot more leeway. For example, a library director might request to spend $700 for library programs next year instead of $500 because there's more participation. Or because the library strategic plan indicates the library is going to get new carpeting this year, the director would need to make sure to include like that bigger capital expense in the budget for this next round. Next up is where the entire board comes in. So at the board meeting, the board's asked to make any comments or changes to the budget and ask their questions. So again, this is one of your major roles and duties as a board member, is to modify and approve the budget. So it indicates the library's priorities for the next year and then how the library is expected to spend the money. Once it is approved, the next step is for this budget request to go to the city or county councils or commissions for every taxing body that the library has to be approved. This is also a really great time for the library director and board president to give an update on everything fabulous that the library has been doing for the past year and what they plan on doing with these funds in the future. This is also where things can get really dicey and weird. So, you know, the library board is who controls what's done with the library fund, but the council or commission still needs to approve that budget within the larger context of the entire jurisdiction's budget. So some commissions will allocate extra general fund monies to the library every year. That's fabulous. And then if the budget's approved, great. If it isn't approved, we go back to the budget will get modified to the director and board. The board needs to approve it again before it goes back up to that funding body. And it can be rather cyclical, but hopefully, if you have a good relationship with your funding bodies, they're going to inform you well ahead of time, well ahead of this actual budget meeting, what restrictions are going to need to be placed on funding for the year due to things like drops in oil prices or, you know, a once in a lifetime global pandemic. So then once the budget is approved by the council, commissions, the library gets to spend those funds as indicated in the budget for the next year. This isn't to say that like if a unique opportunity presents itself or there are extenuating circumstances, the library director may approach the board and request for an increase in funding for one item of the budget from savings or from another budget line item. I also want to take just a minute and talk about the relationship between board members and city and county commissioners. I really want to encourage you to have a collaborative instead of a combative relationship. I really support these positive relationships. It's important for board members to show support for the library by attending their meetings, and especially budget meetings at the city and county level. Since trustees are appointed by the council or commission, it's great to show that you are involved and really invested. And then this helps establish those relationships and helps you remain cordial. And I think it's important to realize that board and then city and county reps are probably going to have different priorities, but you should be able to respect those differences between you all. I'll leave it there. I know sometimes there are tense relationships and personalities get involved, but I just really, really want to encourage you to work on making sure that not only that there is a relationship, but that it's positive and professional so that everybody can move forward smooth sailing and the library can succeed. Okay, so a lot of you are really familiar with your library's budget. It probably is a line item budget that lists each item and then an amount budgeted for the next year. This helps break down the categories, both of when the money is coming from and where the money is going. It's really helpful for comparing across years, but Century Code says that you must prepare your budget request in the way that your auditor dictates. So you're going to need to speak to your auditor and follow the correct procedure for your funding area. Oh, I see I have a chat. Janet, every year this is a struggle because the library doesn't have the opportunity to go back and approve a revised budget. 1% over happens between going to the board's approval and going to city council. So Janet, this comes back to my lovely disclaimer of every city and county handles their money differently. And the only way I can really see preventing this cyclical pattern for you would be to start having these budget conversations earlier about what's reasonable to expect. But yeah, so we have discussed going forward approving the proposed budget. And I don't think it's unreasonable to have your board say, we are comfortable going up to 1% over, or if some changes need to happen, as long as the board approves that at the initial time of approving the budget, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I wish that wasn't the case, but if that's the way that the timing ends up for everybody, I'm not sure if you could call a special meeting of your board. I know there's a lot of special meetings around budget times. If that might help. I hope, okay, yes, you're welcome, Janet. Okay, and back to line item budgets. So I have a list of revenues and expenditures on this slide. There's obviously way more than on here, but these are just some really common items to budget for. By breaking it down by like the different types of materials that the library purchases, it's really easy to see where you can add funds and where funds may need to be taken away in the case of budget cuts. When you're looking at budget cuts, I really encourage you to look at your ROI or your return on investment of a specific line item. So this might be looking at circulation of new books in comparison to their cost, or the participation levels of different programs. An example would be there's a handful of libraries across North Dakota that currently pay for access to the Minitex database collection, but they don't have any usage in their databases. So that would be considered a low return on investment. So I always say the databases are a great resource. Let's talk about how to promote these databases. But if they're potentially facing budget cuts, this might be one thing they can cut because it has such a low return on investment currently in their community. So like I said right away, budgets are a guide. They're a living document. They're not the be-all end-all of exactly how your funds should be spent. There's always going to be minor adjustments that need to be made because you can't tell the future. COVID-19 is like the perfect example of this because it changed how every single library was providing library service. So it's very likely that in the past year, your library hosted less programs, or at least less expensive programs. So not all of your programming funding was spent, but you also probably purchased an excess of like hand sanitizer and PPE for your staff. This couldn't have been predicted. So it's important that the library board remains flexible with the budget in these cases, and not just like refuse to buy hand sanitizer because we didn't budget for it last year when we didn't know that there would be a pandemic. It's also likely that if your library budget indicates $1,000 for books, that your library might spend like $1,000.72 or $996. This is not a disaster. A program or a problem would be like if you spent $500 or $5,000 more than the budgeted amount without consulting the board. But this little bit of leeway is not going to be the end of the world unless your little bit of leeway adds up to too much leeway in the overall budget at the end of the year. The library board should be appraised of the status of the budget at every board meeting so that all of the finances are being accurately tracked. So halfway through the year, approximately half of the funds should be spent in most cases. Okay, so state aid. One of the largest sources of your library's funding is likely going to come from the state aid to public libraries. We are in the middle of legislative session right now, so I can only give you last biennium's numbers. But for 2019-2021 biennium, the state legislature appropriated $1,737,582 for state aid to public libraries to be distributed to eligible public libraries. So eligibility is laid out very explicitly in Century Code, and it boils down to 5 main things. You need to apply for state aid, be established and operated in accordance with the law, participate in interlibrary loan, and then maintain local funds as laid out in 5424.202.2. There's a lot of twos in there. I'll go through that maintenance of effort in a slide or two. And then the library also needs to fill out an annual report. If all of this sounds very familiar to you, it is because the state aid application and annual report reporting periods are open right now until the end of March. Please make sure that your library director is filling these out. The state aid application is filled out in partnership between the library director and the auditors of your various taxing bodies. The forms for state aid really are pretty straightforward. They ask that the library discloses their financial information at a local level, and then it has a series of maybe 15 yes or no questions about how the library operates in relationship to the law. State aid funds need to be, and this is quoting directly from Century Code, expended by public libraries for the purchase of library materials, supplies and equipment, salaries for library staff and services. No funds may be used for land acquisition, construction, or investment. State aid. Oh, okay, here we go. I have a reminder to myself here. State aid to public libraries is an incredibly different thing from the North Dakota Library Coordinating Council standards for public libraries. And they're very often confused, but they are two completely different things. The standards for public libraries look at core sets of standards for all libraries in the state to see if they are competitive for grants from the North Dakota Library Coordinating Council. Those are called library vision grants. State aid to public libraries, which is laid out in Century Code, looks at the law to determine eligibility, and it comes from a completely different set of funds within the state library. Okay, so the grant formula for state aid is also laid out in Century Code. So not all libraries receive the same amount of funding from state aid to public libraries. It is largely dependent on the population and square miles of land, and then if you are a city or county. So if you are operating with both, or multi-counties, multi-cities, the formula looks at each of those jurisdictions separately. Grants to eligible public libraries must be in accordance with this formula as per Century Code. $1 or a percentage thereof for each person residing in the city or county operating or providing financial support for the public library as determined by the latest official federal census. And number 2, $5 per square mile or 259 hectares or a percentage thereof of land within the geographical boundaries of each county operating or providing financial support for a public library. And then there's also an entire additional incentive list and limitations for local funding that's laid out in the following section of Century Code that looks at the number of mills allotted to the library. I'm not going to read those all to you. They really make a slide look messy, but the links are in the LibGuide. And then if you have any questions about the formula, how much your library has received in the past, how to increase the amount of state aid dollars you receive, you can reach out to me and I will direct you to our administration office. And we can walk through this with you step by step. It's a really complicated formula. And we're constantly working to make this better and more efficient. Maintenance of effort is the one area of the state aid application where a lot of librarians will get confused about your state aid eligibility. So I've copy and pasted the exact verbiage on the slide for you to read, but I'm going to go through an example because it can be really confusing. As a board member, and even maybe as a library director, you're not going to be doing these calculations, but it's really important to understand that these calculations are happening, because if local funding drops, your library may or may not be eligible for state aid anymore if it drops too much. So it's an incentive to keep your local funding up. It's really important for advocacy efforts because you need to be able to explain this to your funding bodies. So a public library is not eligible to receive funds if the governing body has diminished from the average of the 3 preceding fiscal years the appropriation in dollars derived from the mill levy for public library services under section 403802. And then number 2, if the governing body is levying the maximum number of mills it can levy without having an election to increase the mill levy, and the appropriation is diminished below the average of the 3 preceding fiscal years solely because of a reduction in the taxable valuation, then the public library is eligible to receive funds under this chapter. So here is my happy example slide. So let's say I have the funds laid out for 3 years, A, B, and C. 30,000, 33,000, 30,000. So looking at the average of the past 3 years would be $31,000. So then the funds levied in your 4th year need to be equal to or higher than that $31,000. So if they dropped down to 30 again, or stayed at 30 in that 4th year, you would be having a maintenance of effort issue. There is the little asterisk in there. So if your mills stay the same, but your property tax values go down, causing the funds to drop, you likely are going to be okay due to the second part of that statute that I had back there. That looks at, like, if you can't increase your funds without a vote because you're at the mill levy cap, then you're still okay. But if your mills are adjusted because of that local support drop, not because of property taxes dropping, that's when you have that maintenance of effort issue. And then if you're anything like me and you really, really, really enjoy reading Century Code for some reason, I will again direct you to our state aid LibGuide so you can look at a really interesting Attorney General opinion that looks at this topic. But Again, some cities and counties operate under this home rule charter that alters their taxing restrictions. And so that Attorney General opinion explains how maintenance of effort is determined for those libraries. If you do happen to have questions about that, I can't answer them. So I'll encourage you to talk to your director, and then you can call the state library. And again, our administration office will help explain to you how, in a home rule city, how maintenance of effort is calculated. I really want you to understand state aid as well as you possibly can. It's mushy for any of us that have been doing it for a number of years, and people that have been doing it far longer than I have. Onwards. Now on to the lighter part of the day. Grants, another great source of funding. So there are a lot of places you can look for grant opportunities for your library. There is a link in our LibGuides to a bunch of different like national, regional, and statewide grants. Looking for and applying for grants is a really great way to fund activities that aren't covered in the library's pre-established budget. And since they aren't a guaranteed source of money, you don't want to rely too heavily on them to fund things that the library needs to do. But they're a great way to do one-time projects or programs, to do a pilot program, to see if it's something that the library wants to continue to do. And then the North Dakota Library Coordinating Council, they put grants out typically twice a year, and those are called Library Vision grants. The bigger ones tend to be in the fall, and there's some lighter ones that come out in the spring. So grants from the Coordinating Council are either non-competitive, which means that any library in the state is eligible, or they're competitive, which means that the libraries are going to need to meet the 25 developing level standards as laid out by the Coordinating Council. Again, that link should be on our LibGuide. The standards themselves are determined once a year on the annual report. There are 3 tiers, the developing, excelling, and future focused tiers, and they all build upon each other. So an example would be the developing level requires a children's summer reading program, but then the excelling and future focused levels require increasing numbers of programming for all ages. The standards were written to be achievable and aspirational, but most notably, the developing level standards are all able to be met by any library, regardless of size or funding level. And that is why the Coordinating Council feels that they're a reasonable benchmark to be eligible for competitive grants. So example of grants that the Coordinating Council has done in the past would be collection development grants to add more books or movies to the collection. They've done makerspace grants to enhance programming. We did a partnership grant for libraries to collaborate with each other and community organizations to do new and inventive programs for the communities. And so it's well worth making sure that your library is meeting these developing level standards in order to be eligible for these grants. But in more general, when you're applying for grants, most libraries are going to have the director or project administrator, so an assistant director or like a children's programmer, if it's a children's grant, fill out the grant application with the approval from the board. So this is especially true if the grant requires like matching funds or more time by staff than they would typically have. Trustees may be asked to review applications before they're submitted. Again, that one just kind of depends on the grant. But if that's the case, check for spelling and grammar. Make sure that the application directly relates to the goals of the grant, and make sure it provides context that may not be obvious to those outside of the project. I love reading grant applications for any grant, not just grants through the Coordinating Council. So you can always send them to me and I'll give you my 2 cents. I always think it's nice to have somebody outside of the project look them over. Another thing to note is that larger grants, especially through national organizations, may require a 501c3 tax exempt status. This is not something that the public library can obtain because you're not a nonprofit. It can be held by a friends or a foundation group. So like a Friends of the Library group, or the library can work with a local community grant foundation which will operate a 501c3 on their behalf. And then the next, like, most popular ways for libraries to receive money is by fundraising. So a lot of libraries, like I said, they'll do bake sales, book sales, ask really politely for donations, but really any event that you can think of. Fundraising often requires the assistance of trustees and other volunteers to help staff a table or booth or help get the word out, at the very least, is to talk about it and promote it. You want to make sure that you have a clear message about what the library is fundraising for. People are more likely to give money if it's for something specific, so a certain program, or we are raising funds to get a new reference desk. And then, sorry, I got lost. Fundraising can also be a form of creating new partnerships and helping seek out sponsors for library programs. So a lot of library programs are going to receive prizes from like a local coffee shop or some money from the bank in return for having their logo on the program. And being a trustee really does allow you that flexibility to make those connections in the community from your own network. You're bringing an entire group of people that you work with outside of the library, and you can help foster those connections with the library. And so whenever you get the chance, I want you to help grow those relationships, grow those partnerships to really help integrate the library into the larger community. And then last but not least, we can talk about groups that, excuse me, not every library has, but many do. A Friends of the Library or a library foundation. So friends groups are separate from the library board and library staff. Absolutely separate. They're a collection of people that support the library and assist with fundraising, volunteering, and advocacy. There's typically a yearly membership fee, and then that is combined with their fundraising efforts to help support the library programs and projects. Foundation groups operate in a very similar way, but they're typically going to be dealing with larger projects and focus not just on a small fundraising project, but capital improvements or expansions of services. Both friends and foundation groups are really great opportunities for more people to be involved in the library, and they're really handy because they can obtain a 501c3 tax exempt status, which will help channel in those larger grants. You as a trustee, you can be a part of these groups, but you should not simultaneously be on the board for both groups. I would consider that a conflict of interest. The groups are not under the purview of the board. The board does not like supervise the friends group, but instead everybody's working together towards the common goal of supporting the library. There's typically a liaison between the Friends and Foundation back to the board, whether that is a board member, somebody like the Friends president, or a library staff member that goes to both meetings and reports back about what's going on. That about covers all of my budgeting and funding fun for the day. I hope I didn't overwhelm anybody too much. Again, here's the contact information for me, Carmen and Mary, my boss and grand boss. And we're always happy to answer any of your questions that I can't help with today.